I understand you're on the 8th line on DAF Yud Gimel Amid Aleph. So we're learning about bundled tzchach. Bundled tzchach, the Mishnah had said, is a problem. The Gemara had explained that the reason why it's a problem is midrabanan, all bundled tzchach is problematic because certain types of bundled vegetation, bundled sticks, or things like that, people will sometimes put on a surface to dry. And we're worried that since this bundle was not put on this roof area for schach purposes, it was put there for drying, if a person were to change his mind and then designate it as schach, it wouldn't count, it wouldn't be kosher. Because it has to be placed mitchila from the outside, it has to be placed on for shading purposes, for schach purposes. And therefore the rabbis made an across-the-board takana that all bundled vegetation cannot be used for schach. That's the general rule. So now we're up to Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Ravina Bar Shila, Hani Dukri Dekani Mesachachin Behu. That if you have certain kinds of, the Gemara had talked about the previous case, which was Afkusa de Dikla. And this is really the same kind of case. Many times, growing near a palm tree are smaller little growths, like little fronds that grow outwards from the ground. If you're from Florida or California, you've seen that, right? So, and what the Gemara had said previously is that even though it looks like separate growths, but since they're all connected, so then it's perfectly fine. That's not called like a bundle. And the Marcus says, we'll take it even one step further. Even if you were to want to close the fronds, close the shoots, with wrapping a string around it so that it will act as a solid mass of schach, that's also okay. Because even though this is not called bundling is where you take disparate items and you bundle them together. Here, it's really one item that's joined at the bottom, right? And you just want to bring it all closer together, so that's perfectly okay. So the Gemara says a similar case when it comes to bamboo. Hani dukri dekani mesachachin behu, afal gav de agidi ninhu, eged bidei shamayim lo shemei eged. Similarly, if you by bamboo plants or trees, whatever, I mean, sometimes bamboo can shoot up 20 feet, 30 feet in the sky. Sometimes as an adjunct to that major bamboo growths are little bamboo shoots that stretch out and shoot out in all different kinds of ways. Even though by bunching them together it looks like a bundle of vegetation, but since it's all joined at the bottom from the root, it's still considered to be one. It was joined together by God, so to speak, by heaven, and so therefore this is an act of God. It's not considered to be a bundle by human hands, and therefore it's a problem. And furthermore, afal gav dehadar agid lahu igid bechad lo shmei eged. And therefore, even if you were to take a string and tie around the top so that you could get a more densely bunched together bunch, that's perfectly fine because it's unitary in its nature, and therefore that's not called an eged. That's not called a bunching. Okay, Tanya Nomi Hachi Kanim Vidukranin Mesachachin Bohen. And the Brisa really says that. It says bamboos and dukranim and these shoots, you're allowed to use as schach. So the Gemara just wants to clarify, Kanim Pshita. What do you mean, bamboos? Bamboos, obviously, you can use as schach. What's the chiddush of the Brisa? So Ema Kanim Shel Dukranin Mesachachin Bohen. But it means that the shoots of bamboo are allowed to be used as schach. Next statement of Rav Chisda. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Ravina Bar Shila, Hani Mirarisa Da'agma, Adam Yotzei Bahen Yedei Chovasa B'Pesach. This is really now jumping from Sukkot to Pesach, because Rav Chisda is addressing different issues of vegetation. So Rav Chisda said another statement in which was that swamp horseradish, that root, the chazeres, that grows in the swamp, you're allowed to use it for moror on Pesach. So Meisvei, let's challenge this. It says in the Brisa, Ezov velo Ezov Yavan, velo Ezov Kuchli, velo Ezov Midbari, velo Ezov Romi, velo Ezov Sheish Lo Shem Lavoy. That when we talk about using, there are different protocols where you have to use a hyssop brush. The most famous one is the paraduma. When you want to sprinkle the water and ash of the paraduma, you have to use a hyssop brush, which is a vegetation like a bush. However, there's specific instructions as far as what species of brush it is. It's specifically the hyssop. But if it's the Greek hyssop, or if it's the bluish hyssop, or the desert hyssop, or the Roman hyssop, or any other hyssop that has an additional name to it, so that's not kosher. It has to be the standard hyssop that's just known as hyssop, not known as any other type of hyssop. So the Gemara says this is a kasha, because why are you telling me that swamp horseradish is kosher? It seems like when the Torah prescribes a specific item without any shem lavoi, without any modifying name, you have to dafka use that species. You can't use alternate species that just are, that have a second name to them. So the Gemara answers, Amar Abaye, Kol shenishtana shemo kodem matan Torah, uboas Torah v'hikpida alav biyadua sheyesh lo shem lavoi. V'hani lo nishtana shemayu kodem matan Torah klal. So the way I'm understanding the answer based on Rashi is like this. When it comes to, by the way, does anyone know why we have a jar of herring on the table? I don't even know how old that is. But
I'm not excited about it. It was yesterday.
It showed up yesterday, but it's been out here since yesterday. All right, donation to the Brotherhood. No, it's probably
Peter can't lift it here. It's not old enough either.
Okay. I didn't mean to be. I was thinking about mora or herring. I don't know. Maybe someone used it as a prop. All right. Anyway, so the Gemara answers. So the Abaya gives one teretz. He says, when you think about types of vegetation that were used in the ancient world in the pre-biblical era, so hyssop was very much an ancient world item. People used hyssop for a lot of things, and before the Torah was even given, there were a number of different types of species of hyssop that were known. So therefore, when the Torah states, I want you to use azov, which is the standard hyssop, it means only use that type and don't use the Roman hyssop or the Greek hyssop, etc., etc., etc. But if the Torah says use moror, and in the biblical era, there was no usage in common use for moror. So therefore, the Torah is not telling you specifically this species and not that species, because there was no common usage of multiple different species of moror. And therefore, the Torah is not precluding one moror over another moror. As long as it's a type of horseradish, it's perfectly fine. So that's a bias teretz.
How are we supposed to know that answer?
I guess Abaya was a historian. Abaya, who must have known.
Horticulture is historian.
Yeah, probably. So, and by the way, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says this is an illustration about the brilliance of Chazal, their worldliness, not just their knowledge of Torah, but their knowledge of botany and zoology and all of these other things. So Rava says, I have a different teretz. Hani mirarisa stama shmayhu, v'hai dekorile mirarisa da'agma mishum de'mishtakach ba'agma. He says, swamp moror is not a different species of regular moror. It's the same species. That's not like the hyssop, which is there are different species of hyssop, but this is all one species. The swamp horseradish is the same horseradish that you grow in your backyard. The reason why it's called swamp horseradish is that there's a certain swamps that are prevalent with this particular root, but it's really all the same, and that's why it's permissible to use. Okay, let's go weiter. Amar Rav Chisda. Iged bechad lo shmei eged, sholosh shmei eged, shnayim machlokas Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbanan. Now, anytime there is a requirement or a prohibition of eged, which means a grouping together. So therefore, let's say for SUKKAH, we know that you're not supposed to create a bundle. For hyssop, you have to create a bundle in order for it to work. Because, like the Rabbeinu Hananel says, we learn from the law of where it says, paint the doorposts with blood by makas bechoros. The Torah says, "Ulakachtem lochem agudas ezov." Take for yourself a bundle of hyssop. So therefore, we learn anytime the Torah uses the verb likicha in the context of ezov, like say by the laws of paraduma, you also have to. You can't just take one hyssop branch. You have to take a bundle of hyssop branch. Okay. So the way that it works is that Rav Chisda says, I know that if you just have one branch, that's not called an eged. If you have 3 branches, I know that is called an eged for sure. What about 2? He says 2 is a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. Ditnan, mitzvahs ezov shlosha klochim, uvahen shlosha giv'olin. that the proper way the Tanakama says that the proper way to do the ezo for the paraduma is to have 3 branches, and each branch has a head, which is a brush-like substance. And that's why hyssop is used, because it's got a brushy kind of tip to it. And Rabbi Yossi Omer, mitzvahs ezov shlosha givolim, v'shiyar of shnaim, v'garduma of kol shehu. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. He says the mitzvah of ezov is, I agree, lechatchila you should use 3 branches. However, if one of the branches falls or breaks, and you only are left with 2, that's also okay. And not only that, but as long as you originally tied more than one together, even if over the course of time that the tips break off, even b'di'evid 1 is okay. So kasal kadaitin midishiyar of shnaim tchilasanami shnaim v'haydek katani shlosha mitzvah. So our thinking is that what is really Rabbi Yossi communicating to us? Rabbi Yossi is trying to let us know that not only, the fact is that an eged really is 2. And that's why he says that if you only have leftover 2 branches, that b'di'evid is okay. And that's why, because an eged is 2, according to Rabbi Yossi. It's only lechatchila that you should have 3. Umid Rabbi Yossi shlosha lemitzvah l'rabbanan shlosha la'akev. So therefore it must be that the Chachamim who disagree with Rabbi Yossi, what's their area of disagreement? They say no, it is necessary to have 3 because anything less than 3 is not an eged. So therefore you see that this is the machlokas. So the Gemara challenges that. It says, V'hatanya Rabbi Yossi Omer Ezov shetchilaso shnaim v'shiyarav echad pasol ve'eno kasher ad she'etchilaso shlosha v'shiyarav shnayim. Rabbi Yossi is quoted explicitly in this brisa as saying that if you start off with 2 branches and you tie those together, then that's pasol. It's only if you started off with 3 and one of them broke off or fell off afterwards, that's where we say b'di'evid it's kosher because you started off with a proper eged. So you see very clearly that Rabbi Yossi holds that you mamish need 3, right? You need 3 to be called an eged. So the Gemara says, Eipoch l'Rabbi Yossi shlosha la'akev l'Rabbanan shlosha la'mitzvah. So really you have to switch it around. Really you're right. Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that the definition of an eged is 3. It's if you tied up 3 branches together and one fell off. So since you started with a bunch of 3, then you fulfilled the criteria of an eged, and you can continue sprinkling with the 2 branches, because at the bottom, I guess, maybe there's still a little piece of the 3rd branch attached, right? But according to the Chachamim, they're the ones who say that that's only lechatchila that you need 3. But really, technically, according to the Chachamim, 2 is sufficient. V'hatanya, and here's the brisa that demonstrates that. Ezo shetchilaso shnayim ushiyarav echad kasher ve'eno pasol, that, and this is really the Chachamim speaking now, that a hyssop roach that started off as 2 branches, or if you started off as 2 and 1 broke off and you're left with only 1, so b'di'evet that's kosher. Ve'eno pasol ad shehei tchilaso ushiyarav echad. And it's only pasol if you have 1 solitary branch that you started off with, or if you have 1 leftover branch, and that's the only solitary branch. The Gemara says, wait a minute, what are you talking about? You just said before that if you started with 2 and you left off with 1, that's kosher b'di'evid. Ushiyar v'echad pasol amar shiyar v'echad kosher. So how can you say that in the same breath? So the Gemara says, what we mean to say is, Ela ema ad shetei tchilaso kishiyarav echad. What it means is that if you started off with 1 branch, then meaning that you try to get away with what would be kosher with shirayim, what would be kosher if you start off with 2 and then 1 breaks off and you're left with only 1 and a little shtickle of the second one, so b'di'evid that's kosher. But you try to do that lechatchila by only using 1 branch, then that's going to be pasal. That's really what the brisa means to say. And so therefore we've demonstrated that brisa goes according to the Chachamim in contradistinction to Rabbi Yossi, who says you need to start off with 3. If one of the 3 breaks off and you're left with just a shtickle of the 3rd, so b'di'evid that's kosher. Fine. Now, so like I said, this would presumably be the same principle by SUKKAH, that the only time that bundled SUKKAH is a problem is only if it's 3 or more. Darash Moreno.
Does have anything to do with the same thing? A few days ago, you told us the example, if you take 1 hair and you make a knot in it, then
this is a very similar discussion, but over there the discussion was chatzitza, and over here the discussion is what's called an eged. right? So hair has a unique feature. I don't know whether there's any real connection that you can make other than the fact that there too, we were discussing 3 verses 1, and then we weren't sure about 2. Here it's also 3 verses 1, and we have a machlokes by 2. Okay, it's a good sushtel, but I'm not sure if there's any halachic connection. Dorash Meremor, Hani Isuraisa Desura Misachachin Behu, because Afal Gab da Ogdan Leminyana Ba'alma Hu da Ogdan. There's a certain kind of surah, a bunch of sticks. If you go to surah, you can buy sticks by the dozen. Okay. But it's okay to use that as schach. The reason is because when people buy these sticks, they immediately untie them as soon as they get home. The only reason for tying them is not because you want them to be connected, but just to travel, just to transport them. It's like when you buy something at the Costco, and you have those little plastic things. As soon as you get home, you undo those plastic things, right? So it's the same thing here. Since we're not worried that people are going to put them on a storage area to dry out, that's not generally the way people do it, then that's perfectly fine. That's not part of the gezerah of not using bundled things. Okay, Amar Rabbi Abba, Hani Tzvi Fidu Urvini, Kevin Shehutra Rashi Ma'adanim Shalahem Kesherim. So here we're talking about a certain kind of hut structure which was well known in the times of the Gemara. When you would go out bird hunting, okay, so you would make for yourself something called a tzrif, which was a hut. It was a makeshift hut. You'd make it out of arava, really tall arava branches, willow branches. And what they would do is they would typically take these branches and make them stand vertically, but as the taller you got, you would tie them in such a way that they would curve inwards until the final, when you get to the very top, you take a big piece of rope and you tie it very tightly. And this was sort of like your hut. Maybe you do a little quacking inside. I'm not sure exactly what would happen in there, but you would stay there, I guess, as sort of your laying in wait for your bird hunt. Right? Or I don't know. Rashi says it was for bird hunting, but maybe in Canada it would be for ice fishing. But the point is that
that's all you're doing.
the point is that this can be used as a kosher a sukkah, provided what? You have to undo that top rope, because otherwise you're dealing with an aguda, you're dealing with a bundle, right, of vegetation. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, v'ha agidi mitasoi. But even if after you undo that top rope, you still have other connections that are bundling the aravas together in order to cause it to taper inwards. So the Gemara says we're not worried about those. Amar Rav Papa deshari lehu. Rav Papa says you have to untie those as well. But Rav Huna Bered Rav Yeshua says afilu tema delo shari lehu kol eged sheino asi lataltal lo shmei eged. No, those connections, those are looser connections. If you try to pick up that group of willows without that top string rope connecting them, the whole thing would fall apart. You wouldn't be able to transport it. And any kind of bundling or material that's used to cause things to stay together but cannot be used for transportation purposes, that's not called an eged. Okay. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Shmuel, Yerako Shamru Chachamim, Adam Yotzei Bahan Yidei Chavasu B'Pesach, Mevi'in Es Hatuma Ve'in Chotzitzin B'Fnei Hatuma. Okay, so the first thing we need to understand is that we know that standard food items are makabel tumah. They contract tumah. However, if you have a vegetable that is normally not used, let's say only used one time in the year for maror, that's not called a standard oichel, and therefore, other than, I guess, that one time that you want to use it, it's because it's not called an oichel, it's not makabel tumah. However, the Chachamim were gozer on this kind of substance, this kind of a vegetable, and they said that it's mevias hatuma, which means that when it's moist, and it's like a leafy kind of vegetable, if you were to place this over a roof and covered the roof with these leaves, and then you had corpse flesh underneath this overhang, and you were standing there, so then you would be makabel tumah. You would become tummy because you're under an ohel of these leafy vegetation. However, it's not chotzeitz b'fnei hatuma. Normally, if you have a duly constituted ohel, and like we learned, you have tefach of airspace between the corpse and the roof, so then anything above that roof is not makabel tumah. The roof is chotzeitz b'fnei hatuma. It stops the tuma from traveling upwards. Okay? However, with this vegetation, that's not the case. And that this is a takanas chachamim. And the reason is because these leaves wither and they become very brittle. And therefore we treat them as really just as they're not there. We treat them as they're not there because eventually they're going to just shrink and shrivel and become very brittle and disintegrate, and therefore it can't be chaytzeitz b'fnei hatuma. So the Gemara says, and furthermore, uposlan besukkah misham avir. Furthermore, if you try to put these things on your sukkah and treat them as vegetation, so there's going to be a problem with this vegetation. Number one, even if you were going to say that it has a status of a food item and it cannot be used as schach, this is worse than that. This is worse even than using a food item for schach. When you take a food item, the reason why can't it be used as schach? Because it's makabel tumah. Anything that is makabel tumah cannot be used as schach. However, if I take an opaque substance that's makabel tumah and I put it on my sukkah, as long as I don't have 4 contiguous tfachim of width of that substance, the sukkah is still kosher. This, however, is worse. If I were to take these leaves, even let's say the leaves are makabel tumah, even if I have less than 4 tfachim, it's still going to be problematic. Why? Because we treat this like air. When it comes to air, anything more than 3 tfachim of airspace in the middle of my sukkah disqualifies my sukkah. And the reason why we treat this like air is because since it's so fine and it's going to shrivel very quickly and it's going to deteriorate, so therefore we treat it like it's air, we treat it like it's non-existent. This is very relevant ramifications when, let's say you have, bamboo on your sukkah. And you notice you have a big patch of, there's one place where you just, like the sukkah is not exactly square, you couldn't get the bamboo mamish to go right there. So you say, you know what, I have big leaves in my backyard, I'll just trim some of the leaves and I'll put them there. If, and this is paskin in Shulchan Aruch, if the leaves will wither before this sukkah is over, so then you treat them like the withered substance, you don't treat them like the robust, moist substance that they are now. So if by the end of sukkah it's going to be more sunlight than shade in that spot, then that's not called kosher schach in that spot, even if right now it's very shady. So that's really what the and like the Gemara says, my time akaven delchiyavshi parti v'nafli command delesnu dami. Even though right now it may be moist and it may look shady, but eventually it's going to very quickly it's going to wither and deteriorate and it's going to become like dust. So then it's almost like it's not here right now. V'amar Rabbi Abba Amar Rav Huna habotzer lagas ein lo yados. Now, this is laws of Tumah. There's a whole Maseches called Maseches Yadayim. What is Maseches Yadayim about? It's all about the stem or the branch that protrudes from a fruit. And the halacha is that if that stem is desirable, so then it acts as a conduit for Tumah. Even though normally a piece of wood is not makabel Tumah, but if it's acting as a stem, or what literally yad is a handle, for a piece of fruit, then just like the fruit is susceptible to Tumah, its yad, its handle stem or branch, is also susceptible to Tumah. Such that if, let's say, a sheretz were to touch the stem, then the entire apple or fruit would become tameh. Just as an illustration. So, habotzer lagas ein lo yados. If, however, I'm harvesting grapes, and the grapes have vines attached to them, those vines do not act as yadayim. And the reason is, as we'll see momentarily, is because you don't want those vines or branches to be attached to the grapes. And since they're not desirable, they don't act as a yad, as a handle to transport tumah to the produce.
So something like, let's say nana, which you can use it for tea and very tasty. Is that different than slate pine, which is not like something that could be a food item? Is that different than?
Well, I'm not sure. That's a separate question. Here we're talking about a branch that's completely inedible. And it's a question of, is it considered ancillary to the fruit, in which case it is makabel tumah.
They use vines in the production of wine.
They do, but apparently only to a limited degree. You'll see in the Gemara that it's considered undesirable in this particular kind of wine production.
It's not like you're doing lagat. If you're taking it home for eating grapes.
Yes, that would be different. If you're taking it home for eating grapes, that would be different, absolutely. For Rav Menashia Bar Gada Amar Rav Huna, Hakotzel Ischach Ein Lo Yados. That if a person is harvesting branches for schach, and it happens to be that at the end of one of the branches you have some fruit, so that branch that you want to use for schach is also not a yad. And of course, it's apparent why, because your objective here is not the fruit. Your objective here is the branch. And since the branch is what you want, you don't want the fruit, so then this entire structure, this entire system is not here for the food, and therefore there's nothing here that could be makabel tumah. So the Gemara now says, Mando Amar Kotzer, Kol Shekain Botzer, Delo Nichale, Delo Nimtzaye Lechamre. So if you hold, like the second statement of Rav Menashia, that if you're harvesting branches for schach, it doesn't have a yad, so then that's surely true that if you're harvesting grapes and they're attached to their branches, then that's not called a yad. And that's because that's a self-evident reason in that you don't want branches to be connected to your grapes when you're going to be pressing them in the wine press, because that might affect adversely the flavor of the wine. I know Rabbi Black just said that sometimes you use branches, but I think at some point you have to remove them from the. I think there's something called a mash or a mulch or something like that when they first harvest the grapes, then you want them. But once you put them in the vat, once you put them in the press, then you don't want the branches there anymore. So, but man de amar botzer she'ein lo yados, aval kotzer yesh lo yados, denichale delisachech behu ki hechi de lo livadran. So, but the Gemara says, but Rabbi Abba, who said that only grapes are not considered to have yadayim, he says, but if you harvest branches for schach, let's say you harvest stalks of wheat, and at the edge of the wheat, the edge of the stalk, you left in the wheat kernels into the stalk. So it could be that Rabbi Abba would disagree with Rav Menashia, whereas Rav Menashia says that there's nothing, the food is undesirable. Comes along Rav Abba and says, no, many times you do want the wheat kernels to remain attached to the stalk. Why? Because the wheat gives added weight to the stalk. The stalk is very light, the wheat is dense, and that'll prevent the schach from blowing away. So therefore, because the wheat is desirable and it is a food item, then the schach, even though the schach itself is kosher, but the schach will also act as a yad to transport tumah to the wheat. So therefore, should you remove after sukkahs, remove the stalks from the sukkah, and a sheretz had touched the stalks, then the wheat would become tameh as well. So the Gemara now says, Neima de Rav Menashia bar Gada Tanoihi. So let us suggest that this halacha of Rav Menashia, that when you harvest stalks for schach, they don't act as a yad for the wheat, that in itself is a machlokas. Just like Rabbi Abba might disagree with Rav Menashia, we have a machlokas tanoim on this subject. The Tanya, sochei te'enim, ubahem te'enim, if you have fig branches, and at the end of the fig branches there are figs, parchilin uvahen anavim, if you have vines or grape branches, and at the end there are grapes, kashin ubahen shibolim, if you have stalks, and at the end of the stalks there are clusters of wheat, machbedos uvahen tamar, if you have fronds from a palm tree, and at the end of the fronds there are dates, kulan impsolis meruba laochlin kshera vimlav pesula. So in all of those cases, if the branch is greater in mass than the food, then you go after the majority, and therefore it's judged as schach and not as food, and therefore it's kosher as schach. But if there's more fruit mass than there is branch mass, so then you judge it as fruit, and therefore it cannot be used as schach. So comes along the acherim, and the acherim omrim, ad sheyihu kashin meruban al hayados ve'al ha'ochlin. And they say no. They say there has to be more branch than not only the fruit, but also the stems of the fruit that are attached to the branch are counted as the fruit also. In other words, let's say you have a branch, and at the end of the branch you have a piece of fruit. You can't just look at the entire volume of the branch, the wood material, versus the fruit. You have to look only at the branch material up until a certain point. But as you get closer to the fruit, where the branch is used as a handle, or the stem, so then that portion also has to be taken into account on the side of the fruit. And therefore, if you have more volume of fruit and yad, so versus the remainder of the branch, so then it cannot be used as chav. So what do you see? So you see that this is the machlokes. The machlokes is my lav b'haka miflugi. This is the machlokes. The mar savar yesh lahen yados, umar savar ein lahen yados. That this is the machlokes. Does something that's harvested for schach is considered to be having a yad, a handle, adjacent to the fruit or not? So this is the machlokes. So this would be the same machlokus between Rabbi Abba and Rabbi Menashe, the Amoraim. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Abba vaday tanoihi. Well, certainly according to Rabbi Abba, who's machmir and says that harvesting branches for schach, the edge of the branch that's closest to the fruit is considered a yad, he would certainly tell you that he only holds like the acherim, he doesn't hold like the Tanakama. But Rav Menashe bar Gada milema tanoihi, is it also a machlokas tanoim according to Rav Menashe? The Gemara says no. Amar lecha Rav Menashe, no. The kuli alma savri hakotzer lischach ein lo yados. He'll tell you no. Really, in this brisa, everyone would agree that if you harvested it initially for the purpose of schach, then no part of the branch is considered to be a yad for the fruit. Everyone would agree to that. V'hacha b'may askinan kegon shekotzitzan la'achila v'nimlach alehen l'sichuch. The brisa is only addressing a case where you initially harvested this branch for the fruit, and then afterwards, like you harvested a bunch of figs, of fig branches and figs, and you said, you know what, I wouldn't mind eating some figs. Then you realize, wait a minute, SUKKAH is coming. This is the only branch, only vegetation that I have available to cover and use as schach. I'm just going to throw the whole thing on top of my sukkah. So because you changed your mind, but initially it was considered for fruit, then the edge part of the branch that's closest to the fruit is considered to be a yad for the fruit. But if you initially had harvested it for schach, then no part of the branch is considered to be a yad for the fruit. So the Gemara says, "Ikotzasan la'achila maitamayo derabanan." So the question then is, well then, if that's the case, then why do the Chachamim say that there is no yad? If it was initially harvested for the purpose of fruit, then obviously there was a designation of a part of the branch to be acting as the yad, and therefore it should transport the tumah. So the Gemara, and therefore you should have to reckon with it as far as the volume of the fruit is taken together with the edge of the branch. So the Gemara says, maybe it's because the Chachamim hold that by virtue of the fact that you changed your mind, that also removes the yad aspect of the branch. Since you, even though it's true that initially you harvested it for the fruit, and at that point it had the part of the branch that was closest to the fruit was considered to be the yad, but once you change your mind, it's no longer a yad. But the Gemara says that doesn't work, because umi batlei machshava b'hachi. Since when can you change the halachic status of an object that had originally been considered a yad and make it not a yad and remove its susceptibility for tumah just by having a mental thought? The hatnan, don't we learn in the Mishnah, kol hakelim yordim l'dei tumah b'machshava ve'ein olan mitumasan ela b'shinoi ma'aseh, that we have a Mishnah that's brought many places in Shas. In order for something to become susceptible to tumah, let's say you're a carpenter and you have a big piece of wood and you want to make it into a kli. So once you decide, you've whittled it down to the size of a bread box, okay? Once you've made it and you've mentally designated that this is going to be my kli, so then it's subject to being makabel tumah. Then afterwards, if you decide, you know what, I'm going to take this bread box and turn it into a couple of bowls or a couple of forks, then that's, or spoons or whatever it is, that doesn't work. You have to actually start working on it physically in order to alter it, in order for it to be removed from its susceptibility to tumah. And furthermore, shahamaisa motzi miyad maisa umiyad machshava, machshava ena motzi lo miyad maisa v'lo miyad machshava. And the reason is, explains the Gemara, is that only physical working on the object can remove its prior designation, regardless of whether that prior designation was machshava or maisa, mental or physical. But a mental designation is not enough to remove. A mental change of mind cannot remove the status of something. Once it was designated for tumah to be a kli, you can't mentally change it. And here too, the Gemara is arguing, how could the Chachamim say, if Rav Menashe is correct, that the Bryce is talking about where you originally had designated this for fruit, and then you change your mind, you say, I'm going to use it for schach, how is that sufficient, that mental designation, how is that sufficient to make this no longer a yad? You need more than just a mental designation, you would need a physical act. That's where we'll hold it as the question for today. You all have a wonderful day.